amongst a lot of your members, I mean, that ambition to hire great people and therefore to run a company that is virtuous enough to attract the great people must be a significant motivating factor.
Absolutely. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt. If you look at many companies, and I think we were discussing this last night, many companies understand if you want to recruit and retain the best, you have to have an image, an ethical reputation that people want to join you for.
Yeah.
And hence, a lot of people got into CSR. The issue about CSR is it mustn't be an adjunct. It must be part of your DNA. Yeah. That's what really makes the difference. And you can never, that's why I think this thing about your actions speak louder than your words. You know, actually, just do anything for the sakes of PR, whatever it might be, in the press, winning prizes, your people, your employees, and your customers see through it straight away. So unless you do things that are substantive, that are making a difference, that are within your DNA and understood by your employees, you're not going to gain the sort of traction you're looking for to create a better business for yourself and for your employees. But by the way, I should just be really clear about one thing. I'm not, by the way, saying every CBI member agrees with what I'm saying.
For sure.
I mean, you know, but I can tell you there are a lot of people.
I can believe that. I can believe that.
There are a lot of people in talking together, as you're just saying, really, really trying to find how do we balance these pressures of the dynamism of capitalism, the accountability of capitalism, the need to have well-paid employees, the fairness issue, the public opinion issue, the concern about this work could lead politically to steps that could be hugely damaging for everybody, including the poor. You know, so I think people are really conscious of this, is what I would emphasize.
And Francis, do you think? Are you looking slightly sceptical? Are you? No, I just slightly seasonally. I mean, do you think, as somebody who has a lot of members negotiating on the other side, I mean, do you think that there is, you know, a beginning of a shift in attitudes?
I think the intellectual case has been won.
Yeah.
You see.
Okay.
And so I agree, and there are some real deep thinkers from all these different constituencies who are coming together. But you know, I think we need to be frank about this.
It's not a critical mass.
Well, more that we haven't seen the beef, have we? Yeah. I mean, what we know is that in Britain and many other countries, we now have this increasingly large, low-paid army, often in jobs that are very valuable but underpaid, often women, and black and ethnic minority, more likely to be insecure and so on. And that great big belly at the bottom is growing, that the jobs in the middle are being hollowed out. So we're seeing very big structural changes. Now, some people will say that's all about new technology or about a new influx of workers into the global labour market, but we've had that before. For me, those changes are always going to take place. The question is, in whose interests are they developed? And that's where I keep coming back to this thing of fantastic, though I think it is, that we do have thought leaders in the business community. That voluntary self-reform ain't going to happen in my book. It takes more than that. And it takes a more honest discussion about the fact that there is this growing disparity, not just of wealth and income, but power. And I thought, actually, Mike, you made a very interesting comment about, you know, the risk for our democracy of that. This is something I was picking up in the ether in some of those discussions in Davos that deeply alarmed me. I mean, in some ways, it's been played out through the discussion about Greece, you know, where you have the people saying they can't take any more of austerity, they need some help, they need to, negotiate some debt forgiveness, and you have the Troika, which is holding on very firmly to the position that it's taken. Now, that's being played out on the European stage, and it seems to me that we are in a transition period, but we can't be complacent about which way this is going to go. And for me, that gives this discussion some urgency. And that we need to, I think, as Justin said, you know, it can't just be words. We've got to start seeing some action now and demonstrating that there is a better way. We can do it.
And just to add to that, I mean, it's, you know, we don't have that in this country, and we can talk about the lack of payment, but I don't see any way that democracy and capitalism survives an environment where you have 40-50% youth unemployment for a period. It's just inconceivable. And you'll end up either in 1933
Exactly.
Absolutely. Let me bring Clive in, and then I'm going to throw it open to you folks. So we've got about half an hour for questions. I'll take questions in rounds of 3, but and we've got the traditional kind of roving mics. Thank you very much. But Clive, go on.
And that whole threat to democracy, I think, is the issue that we're all facing, which is why I'm, again, delighted that an all-party parliamentary group is beginning to grapple with this and search for political consensus on it. I'm also delighted that Francis was able to spot anything in the ether in Davos with all the fumes from the private jets that were flying in and out, whilst the global elite descended to share with us their wisdom, their great concern and their heartfelt angst about the needs of poor people. But that whole question, as we've talked about it, there's something here around the concept of a new social contract that's required. There's a new relationship needed between capital and labour. And that relationship seems to have slipped badly. It's slipped into something which begins to sound more like servant and master. Even when we hear, and forgive me, Mike, I don't mean you, I've enjoyed every comment you've made tonight, but sometimes when I hear genuinely heartfelt expressions from business people in the business community, even then it can sometimes come across more like noblesse oblige than come across about the fact that there are two equally moral constituents that come together in this process that the Archbishop called creativity, and it's capital and labour. And it was John Stuart Mill who, in 1859, said that the private landowner, let's call that the proxy in the mid-1800s for a business person, the private landowner and the welfare recipient both earn their return from the sweat of somebody else's brow. There's no moral difference between them. They're both earning or receiving income from the sweat of somebody else's brow. And I think there's fruitful area for us to explore in thinking about what the relationship between capital, which is so abundant today, that's the huge difference in the year 2015 to just 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. When we talk about what happened in the mid-1970s in the United States, when productivity began to stop feeding through to pay, or happened here in 2003, it's because there was just so much capital in a post-industrialized world. And that capital is seeking a return, and it flies around the world and seeks to find a business segment it can apply itself to. And those returns on capital, those required returns on capital, may provide the beginnings of a new conversation. I'm in the insurance business. In the insurance business, we write insurance business sometimes for returns on capital as low as 8%. I just pick a number to give it to you because we're relatively comfortable that what we're insuring is predictable. Sometimes as high as 12% because it's not very predictable. And we're taking a risk, and our capital requires a commensurate return. What happens to the 13th percent? Well, in a master-servant relationship, I take it. It's just a sweep. In the 12 was my cost of labour. Why would I share any of that? Now, a new type of relationship between capital and labour might ask a question about that 13th percent. Who does it belong to? Who did it? Where did it come from? And the 14th percent and 15th percent progressively, surely there's some progressive sharing back of something. Now, up to 12, it's tough to make that argument. There is a de minimis cost to attract the capital, and there's a de minimis cost capital has to pay people to come to work and sweat the capital. But beyond the 12, just choose my very boring pedestrian life of insurance. But
I think, Xavier, your point about democratisation, I love this phrase, democratisation of the distribution of capital. There's a rather bigger scale of potential for that now, given the point Clive makes about its abundance.
If you want capitalism to be popular, you need popular capitalism. And I think the one thing that we need to project, and this is probably not what one wants to hear if one is a parliamentarian or has national responsibility or unionist, that we now operate in a global environment. Why have financial assets grown so much? Hence privileging those who own them, equity owner, investors. It's because essentially going back to 1987 and the crash, central banks have been injecting massive amounts of money. And this is continuing at an accelerating pace. There's enormous growth in monetary assets, chasing real assets. So if you're a real asset owner, without doing anything, the value of your equity portfolio or other assets has been growing. Now, what's happened to labor? Let's also look at it in a global environment. 400 million destitute Chinese in the last 10 years now are able to eat perhaps buy a car, have an apartment. So labor is not competing at the national level or at the regional level. Labor is competing at the global level. And it's not just immigration. I mean, there's always been immigration. Countries, nations, languages are made of a collection of other countries and other languages and other people, and that's not going to change. But it's the fact that 5 billion people who were looking at 1 billion wealthy people consuming and enjoying good lives and sending their kids to good schools, for the most, are now competing and want the same. So it's not just China, it's also Brazil and other areas. I'll give you an interesting statistics. The last time Europe had 3 consecutive years of fast-growing corporate profits, there was 2005, 6, and 7, where on average for Western Europe, corporate profits were rising at about 15% per annum. If you look at the blue chip sector, the companies listed on the FTSE 100, the DAX, the CAC in France, and the MIB in Italy, the 4 largest economy. Their profits were rising at 15% per annum. That means a doubling, roughly, of corporate profits over 5 years. So a very prosperous environment. The net job creation performance of the blue chip sector of those listed companies across those 3 years was net negative 0.4%. And that's the truth, is in a globally competitive world, the best you can hope for large businesses that are competing ferociously on the basis of costs. Perhaps they should compete more on the basis of innovation, but there's nonetheless ferocious competition now across more than 6 billion people. At best, you're going to be able to keep the stock of employment more or less what it is. So where are we going to get that new wealth, those new good-paying jobs? And I know it often sounds like a side issue. I believe for once that the only solution, not one of the solutions, the only solution to net additional employment creation. There's nothing wrong with being a large business. I mean, these businesses are still there. We need to nurture them. But the solution to creating new jobs that actually pay well, pricing power in business will never be dictated. I'm afraid that's probably not what some of you want to hear. By regulation or laws, because businesses can move. That's just the reality. But what pricing power that is dictated by is innovation. You innovate a new service, a new product, you have pricing power, you then can pay your employees well. You're also going to be looking for well-educated employees. And that competitive dynamics in the last 15 years, in my humble opinion, has changed radically. So how can we reconcile citizens with a capitalist economy? If it's not too late, maybe it is. I don't believe it is, but we need a global financial and political governance system, for sure, some sort of level playing field. But we also need to ensure that that new wealth creation, that innovation, has the proper and the appropriate type of capital, so that individuals, even if they come from a very poor neighborhood, and there's an amazing wealth of innovative and entrepreneurial power and resource in poor neighborhoods, sinking states, which we do not leverage. This is millions of people in Europe. But we need to get these entrepreneurs a fiscally non-handicapped. Equities are overtaxed and overregulated. People don't even know they exist anymore. Look at the power of crowdfunding. How many new businesses for it? That's one set of innovation. Let's get these entrepreneurs, let's get these kids growing up in neighborhoods to consider that joining a gang is not the only way forward. Maybe they can create a business. It's been done by 65,000 of them in the UK in the last 25 years.
Yeah, let's see some hands. Let me see where you all are. Marvellous, thank you very much. Can we just start there, and then I'm going to weave my way randomly round. But Barbara, do you want to?
Oh, no, I just want to come back on this. I'm all for poor people who do have entrepreneurial spirit to find a way to actually have the financial resource capital to come in to do that. But I think what you've said is hints at a much, much bigger problem, which is really what Francis was talking about, which is actually fundamentally the race to the bottom on labour. And that's what we see in developing countries, that actually labour is not valued and you can move your stuff around so that you get the worst case. And I don't know whether any sets of fiscal arguments can deal with that. That is actually ultimately a moral issue, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Tell us your name and kick us off.
Jeremy Hanson, KPMG, and a member of the UK Commission for Employment and Skills. Great to see the alignment. I wonder if I could push us on the practicalities of productivity. We seem to say that fair jobs require productivity and innovation. Francis said that creativity is not the exclusive realm of the boardroom, and I think productivity isn't either. And it's great to see alignment and vision here, but if it does take collective action to move productivity and innovation, what are the practical things and maybe one magic wand and one practical next step from different panel members?
Yeah, lovely. Okay, who else had their hand up over there? I'll take a punch here. Yeah, gentleman there. Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff Knott. I work with Lord Way. Most of the stress, except the last Xavier and Clive, has been really on living wage and wage levels, which really just keeps people in survival mode. And yet, really, what the rich have is assets. And those assets earn, they multiply, they increase and provide income, fallback, security, and everything. So what campaign is there about transferring assets to workers, basically?
Great.
You know, I'm thinking what, in policy terms, how can you incent, for example, employee-owned companies like John
exactly.
Lewis?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great example. Okay, someone else had their hand up over there. Yeah, okay. Sorry, do you want to just take this gentleman here while the mic is... Sorry, so you at the... no, go on. Let me take this gentleman first, and then I'll come to you, sir. Go on. Oh, no, it's coming to you. The floor's yours.
Well, my name's John Dawson, and I work for a Conservative MP, and I'm qualified to degree standard in economics, so that's why I'm interested.
Could you just put the mic a bit closer to your mouth? That'd be great.
Can you hear me now?
That's great. Yeah, smashing.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, Justin, in his speech, said a level playing field does not exist, and that's what you said we need. And you're just all talking there like intellectuals, because for the last 100 years, it doesn't matter who's been in power, whether it's been Labour, Tory, SNP, or a coalition government. We've always had a huge difference in the rich and the poor, and it's got worse under Labour and you, the TUC leader. I just want to know, it's all right saying we need this, we need that, but in reality, what are you going to do about it? Because nobody's done anything about it, making the ordinary working man better. I think David Cameron and George Osborne, their policies are working. At least they're raising the tax thresholds for the ordinary working people. But really, the rich are getting richer, and don't sit there leading the trade unions, and it doesn't matter whether you're Labour or Tory. And the 4 top jobs in the country, I mean, 41 years ago, I was told we're moving into a classless society, but the 4 top jobs in the country, like Prime Minister, Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Mayor of London, or the Mayor of London, and the future King, they're all old Etonians. So don't tell me about everybody's gone into being equal again. The wealth of the country is in the hands of fewer and fewer people.
I've got the nub of your point. Practical action. Yeah. Can I just take the lady there, second row there? Thank you. And then I'm going to come to you, sir. Yeah.
Emma Osborne. I'm an investment manager. I was wondering whether the panel thought other countries were managing it better and still managing to have a vibrant economy and with the absence of natural resources. So cut out those that have had the advantage of natural resources, cut out those that don't have dynamic economies. Who's doing it better than the UK?
And have you got a view on that question?
Yes, I think there isn't anywhere particularly. I think it's a very deep-seated, rooted issue. I think one of the problems we've got is that we've been a rich economy, and the legacy of that lasts for a very long time, and that causes all the lack of competitiveness in labour, and we're basically sharing what the positive industrial and commercial legacy we've got with the developing economies.
But when you look around internationally, you're not convinced actually that there's another country with a better model at this stage?
No, I'm not.
No. Okay, great. Thank you very much. The gentleman behind you there. They're going to come over there. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Oliver Van Heel, and I lead an initiative by the Aldersgate Group called An Economy That Works. And it's an alliance of businesses, civil society organizations, including the TUC, and when I say businesses, I mean large corporates, who seek to redefine the fundamental purpose of the economy under the understanding that our current singular focus on GDP growth is neither going to deliver prosperity, competitiveness, or sustainability. Which leads to my question. A lot of the points that various panelists made today echo some of the things that we talk about in An Economy That Works, including job creation, equality, well-being, long-termism, inclusivity. However, if we are to secure a good economy for the foreseeable future, there's one critical aspect that I don't think has been addressed at all, and I don't think it's either been addressed in Rock or Sand, the excellent publication, although I base myself on the press for that, from the Church of England.
The book is even better.
But the thing that's not being addressed here is the environment. We cannot have a healthy economy if we do not protect the environment, and by that I mean a low-carbon economy, an economy that strips out waste, an economy that protects the natural environment and biodiversity.
Yeah, perfect. Can I take the lady at the back, right at the back over there, and then I'm going to come forward. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Trudy Elliott. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Town Planning Institute. The Archbishop, when he spoke, talked about one of the 4 elements of an economy based on solidarity as being...
Mike, a bit closer to you.
Sorry. One of the 4 elements of an economy based on solidarity was good and affordable homes. And can I urge that we talk about this discussion about wages in the economy also at the same time as where people are going to live and whether we've got affordable, good homes. Because the number of children in this country living in poor accommodation is growing. We've failed for the last 30 years to build enough homes, and the number of people who have insecure tenure, i.e. less people are owning their home, less people have secure tenure, is increasing at the same time as wages are being squeezed.
Excellent, thank you. If you just take the gentleman with the glasses there, and then the gentleman there.
I'm James Cameron. I'm chairman of the Overseas Development Institute, the ODI, and I founded a business a few years ago called Climate Change Capital, whose strapline was creating wealth worth having. So I want to do 2 things. I want to thank you very much.
It's a good strapline.
Yeah, it's not bad, is it? I want to thank you very much for, I think it's a highly significant speech, and much of the commentary here is first class and genuinely uplifting. But I want to attach it to a request. We're entering election time.
Sorry about that.
Our public debates are not nearly as engaged with these issues as they should be. Each of you have significant resources as individuals or companies or institutions. There's communications power on the panel there. Please make this a public debate. Please put this into this election. I'm absolutely convinced that it will engage people of all ages who don't really care very much about politics normally, who perhaps don't even vote, sadly, who will know this matters. And all of the elements of the speech matter, including the environment one we just mentioned. All of them matter. They're interesting. People care about them passionately. They will engage people of all types. But we don't have it in our current discourse. It's not nearly evident enough in the way we conduct contemporary politics. So that's just my request. It's a thank you, but a big request. Use what powers you have to make this a debate that we can all participate in.
Thank you very much. And then the gentleman there, and I'm going to ask our panel to come back, and then we've got time for another round, so panic not. Sir.
Thank you very much. My name's Paul Gibson, and I work with social enterprises, which are businesses for a blend of social and financial return in between philanthropy and what we might call full capitalism. And when we're setting up a social enterprise, we think about ownership in terms of the employees, society, as well as private ownership. And we think about top levels of pay, and we think about median pay. And we seem, I've been really heartened by the debate tonight, we seem to be at one that the relationship between business and society needs to be recalibrated for the benefit not just of society, but I think of business as well. The idea of legitimacy, license to operate, and so forth. But my question really is whether the legal status of business, which is the company limited by shares, is actually the right model going forwards. It's stood us in good heart over many, many years, and I've grown up with it. But it seems to me it puts too much power in the hands of investors and directors, and not enough power in the hands of the workforce, models, community, society, the environment. I think if we were to recalibrate the company limited by shares in a more mutual way, we could actually end up with a society that's better for everyone.
Great. Xavier, can I start with you? I mean, pick out of that banquet what you would like. But I mean, I thought one of the interesting themes though was about assets, whether it is homes, whether it is shares in businesses. Any reflections on what you've heard?
I think greater share ownership is one way of rebalancing it. Clearly, amongst employees, we're a small company. We've grown. We've multiplied our capitalization about 8 times in the last 6 years. Some of you are investment managers. Take a look at us. But employees share in that wealth. Employees owning that equity. Yeah. The minimum wage in the UK is about £6.50. London wage is £9.15. And we pay the minimum wage, the London wage, for our lowest paid employees, and there's very few of them. So we're at £9.15 as a starting point. We work in a, contrary to some notion, in a ruthlessly competitive world. We've had to cut our costs. Our employment has tripled in the last 4.5 years. So you can hire, you can operate in a competitive environment. You can share the ownership with employees, give them a share in the reward. And this can be, there are many schemes out there where you can even give small amounts of equity every month on a voluntary basis. So the tools are there. And I think sharing that, distributing and sharing the wealth so that employees feel that they have a stake is not a new concept. No. It can be done. And I think that's the way forward. And there are many companies in the UK doing this. I think what's missing in the sense, and the legitimate, I think, anger and the sense of, well, this is a lot of talk but no action, is that there are entire segments of the population that actually do not participate in that. There are millions of employees who are share owners in the UK, and they're not the ones complaining, it's the ones who don't. And so how are we going to create a pool of shareable equity wealth? I go back to my equity themes. Of course, some of you will think that the London Stock Exchange and Equity Exchange, I'm basically blowing my own trumpets. It's 6% of our revenues, equity trading and insurance, a small portion of our revenues. But we need to really leverage the entrepreneurial potential to create new wealth, new enterprise that can be shared right at the beginning with employees. Because the big companies have a really, really big challenge. And as much as they will do for climate change, for corporate and social responsibility, they are facing absolutely ruthless competition. And it's the only thing that I suggest we do not forget, is that competitive dimension doesn't go away if one legislates or imposes, new burdens. So we got to look at new pools of wealth creation that can be shared from the get-go, from the beginning. And I think that's achievable. And the UK has 4.8 million SMEs, the biggest pool in Europe.
Francis, you're poised to follow that point.
Just reflecting on the whole issue of sharing assets. So in the 1980s, the right to buy, an awful lot of our council homes and the best stock were sold off. We now have a generation in London, single parents being driven out because the housing benefit is capped, so they have to live outside of London, and then that impacts on how they can work. We know that we're subsidising low pay to the tune of billions in housing benefits and in work benefits, and we know that the young generation haven't got a chance at all of ever thinking that they could buy somewhere in London. At the same time that in Knightsbridge and Kensington and Chelsea, construction workers are working on constructing swimming pools and cinemas in the basements of those big houses. I mean, it seems to me, what a crazy, crazy situation that we've got into. And although I think that issue, and it was raised here, that issue of Britain's very particular class system is important, and the role that assets play in that, I would like us to also think about our collective assets, because we've also seen many of our most important and cherished public assets sold off, Royal Mail, many of our public services, and often to the detriment of the quality of services in rural areas, for the most vulnerable communities. So whilst it's very interesting, I think, to think about assets and individuals, it's also really important to think about our public assets and our public space and the important role that that plays in any society and economy.
Very good. Clive, I mean, Resolution Foundation has been at the forefront of thinking about practical steps for some time.
And both of the gentlemen on the front row here asked the same question in admittedly charmingly different ways, which was, so what are you going to do? What's the lever you're going to pull? And if I could address that single question of a lever, but also against this backdrop of assets, because we can't get away from it.
No,
there is a group of people today, it's at least the 1%, who are drawing most of their wealth from assets. And again, that means earning from, or taking income from the sweat of somebody else's labour. That's the only way to describe an income that comes from your assets. But that single lever, I believe, we would find common ground on is investment. And that investment, back to the question from our fund manager, it must have been Emma, I can't remember your name, a question of where countries are sometimes doing a little bit better, is they have more pronounced and longer term investment programs. No one's doing it great. You know, we could look back on countries over the last 20 years, 1992 to 2012, the annualized rate of investment by China was 8.5% every one of those years. But that's a country, as we know, that is its own special miracle. But it might interest you to know that the next group of countries down included Japan and India. Japan, very large, very industrialized country, both over the same 20 years investing 5% of their annual income in infrastructure and in long-term projects expected to create a base from which their businesses could flourish. The next group down is us in America on exactly half that amount, 2.5%. Right. So that's it. Money in equals money out. Yeah. Does anyone know any other way to do business? That's it. Now, where's the money coming from for that type of investment? That's your question. And now we're back to assets. There's really only two ways you can find money for the kinds of multi-billion pound expenditure that we need to commit to over 20 or 30 years in infrastructure, using housing as a way to productively put income capital to work, and in skills and R&D that then become a common good shared to the whole of British business in its widest possible definition, whether it includes social enterprises or not. So how are you going to find that money? There's two ways. You borrow it or you tax it. And the great shibboleth is, we don't tax assets. They sit there as unproductive. They are unproductive. They are forming a way in which the only thing somebody can actually think to do is limited by their imagination, so they put a swimming pool in their basement, to quote Francis. Really? That's the best you could do? So some kind of what I'd think of as gently prodding tax. You know, in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt, in an attempt to stimulate some kind of movement in a moribund United States, pulled all sorts of levers. There's a horrifying list of ones which were terrible, and we never talk about those because we want to remember they were just awful. But one really interesting one was the hoarding tax on gold. If you're holding it, the economy can't use it. So it's up to you. If you really feel unsure about the world, keep your arms around it. Every day you hold it, it's going down in value. That's the hoarding tax. I'd love to see a hoarding tax.
Excellent. Bob.
Can I add a different dimension onto your question about which countries are doing some different things? And out of G20, actually the two that are the most interesting are actually Brazil and Mexico, because they were some of the most unequal countries in the world, and they have actually over the last few years significantly reduced their inequality. And they did that because they actually dared to talk about redistribution. Which is, you know, what you're sort of saying there, but that is actually how it happened. It was agreed that that had to happen if those countries were going to flourish. Well, I've got the floor. Just a quick one on the GDP please. And the environment.
Please.
I'll just pick up. You could not be more right, of course. I mean, we are living beyond the world's resources, the resource constraints that we have, particularly in areas like CO2 and the nitrogen cycle and all the rest of it. And the problem is, quite rightly, if you keep measuring everything by GDP, we do everything to produce GDP, and not actually. GDP ought to be a measure that is allowing us to look at how the economy is operating in the service of all the things things we want it to do and not the other way around, and we're just driving after GDP. Now, how we ever get off this treadmill is quite a difficult one.
But measures are important.
But measures are important in how they drive things, absolutely. And in a funny way, incredibly important as we go into this year with the climate change deal and so on. I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, we're all talking about this as if the world is in this sort of stable state that we can manipulate things with, and it's absolutely not. I mean, we are looking to a future that, if you don't really take it on, looks pretty ghastly out there.
And Mike, I mean, please pick whatever you like from that, but if you wouldn't mind picking up some of the productivity questions as well, because I think that is...
I mean, I was just reflecting on a couple of things. I mean, one is clearly we need to remember, we need to be realistic about where we are as opposed to where we'd like to be. Yeah. We are in a global world that's highly competitive, and we've had these enormous forces and changes that exist. It's absolutely clear to me that investment, innovation, skills, technology, productivity are what we need to be able to encourage. We have seen societies that have been idealistic and have created much less inequality, for example, Cuba, but without the ability to ever trust themselves to have an election ever again, with high levels of actually education, but never transforming into anything. So I kind of look at that and think we've got to be extremely careful about how we move this debate forward. And in answer to your question, I worked for 14 years in continental Europe, and I do think in this country we're too nervous about effective engagement with different stakeholders. And I would name a country who does do it much better, and they got to there 14, 15 years ago, when everyone thought they were a basket case with their high costs, high social costs, union involvement, is Germany. And there you see extremely constructive engagement with Workers' Council. You see very high levels of productivity. You see extremely sensible, agreed deals on productivity versus pay rises against quite a high social cost. Interestingly, and I may have this slightly wrong, it's got better German than me, but one of the interesting things about Germany is not being a debt-built society at all. Indeed, now it's being heavily criticized because, you know, it's out of kilter. But actually, the German word for debt is the same as the German word for reckless. And it's an interesting, aspect of the culture in Germany, who we certainly 14, 15 years ago, people in this country were writing off. And they're 24% more productive today in motor car manufacturing still than we are, and we have to pay attention.
But what is it in the ethos here that makes us anxious about engagement with stakeholders, more intensive engagement with stakeholders, as you put it?
I don't understand it, because I think whenever it works, and when I just think we've not historically, we've had too much conflict between trade unions, and whether, you start getting in very deep areas, whether this is the cataclysm of the Second World War, which was so much more dramatic for continental Europe than for ourselves in reality, however much we suffered in the Blitz. We didn't suffer the way that millions and millions of people went. And I think that led to a fundamental different approach to engagement between stakeholders in continental Europe. And whilst they've got problems and competitiveness, mainly caused by their politicians, and spendthrift attitude and cheap euro, actually there's been some quite good, engagement between stakeholders, particularly in the trade union movement and the business movement, the management, workers' councils, I've seen them. Yes, you can decry supervisory boards, but you know what? You can have some interesting, and I don't support the two-tier board because I think it gets abused in different ways. But I think there's some really interesting things that we ought to be more open to that could make a difference. And I also lastly think profit sharing, that's a way to improve productivity in the short term.
I know you've looked at this question for some time.
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the great ironies of this, of course, is that the German co-determination system was designed by Ernest Bevin when he was Foreign Secretary. He was a former trade union leader. So I'm always, again, a little sceptical that there's something inherently in one country's culture that, could never happen here, because there are also plenty of examples, which Mike, the automotive industry, where, of course, and it's true for Germany too, of course there are differences, but there's also a sense of a common cause and a sense of a commitment to, for example, an active industrial policy, active investment policy, involvement in workers' representatives in longer-term strategic thinking and decision-making. And I don't see why that has to be just confined to a few particular industries and advanced manufacturing. Many of those companies who operate the car industry, chemicals, others, in their parent countries run those systems of both single and two-tier boards, where, of course, the majority of European member states now require worker representation on the board. If it works there, why can't it work here?
Okay.
So, but just, I think that point about our corporate governance system is really, really important. That I do think the shareholder supremacy model is under severe strain. It's not delivering. It's encouraging that short-termism that's against everybody's interests. And now that we have these big challenges like climate change, where, you know, leaving the market to itself just won't do the job that needs to be done for the good of us all. And actually many companies recognize the need for certainty, regulation, so that they can make their investment decisions. There are huge opportunities here for us to create that new contract that Clive was talking about.
Right. We're almost out of time. I've got time for about 3 more. Can I take that gentleman there? Just very quick, please. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Joe Dilger, educational governance consultant. And just picking up on a few points the panel made, Xavier talked about the great
just
work
really quick,
British Trust about young people entrepreneurs. My question really is to the panel, you're all leaders. How are you giving young people an opportunity, whether through work experience or like Barking and Dagenham College did, having the brief for the new building given out to their students, so the students actually won the bid, won the tender, designed the new building. How are you giving people opportunity as leaders?
Okay, thank you. Gentleman there, beard and glasses.
Eric Beinhocker at Oxford University, and also working very closely with Clive and the Resolution Foundation. I wanted to follow on Francis's comments on corporate governance. Often in Davos and other places, the tenor of these conversations with business is, well, we'd love to engage with these issues, we'd love to do better, be more ethical, serve society more broadly, but we're shackled by the need to maximize shareholder value and our fiduciary duty. Now, questioning this isn't just some lefty liberal idea. Warren Buffett, a pretty good investor, called maximizing shareholder value the dumbest idea he'd ever heard of. So do we need a fundamental debate on the purpose of the corporation and how to reconnect corporations, not with just long-term interests of the economy, but long-term interests of society more broadly?
Smashing. Right, and I'm going to take one more from there, lady there. And then I'm going to have to stop it there, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Sally Mugridge, can we just, out of this evening, have one from the team, from the panel, one big, bold statement of what we are going to do that we can all buy into?
Smashing. I'm going to ask our panel now to just give us a couple of minutes, any sort of final reflections, any answers to those questions, and then Archbishop Justin, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just ask you to not try and summarise the incredible richness that you've heard that you'll be pleased to hear, but any final observations, that would be great. Do you want to kick us off, Barbara?
Well, I'm going to
final reflections and answers.
Well, sorry, but I do.
And actually, you pose a lovely final question, which is, what's the one big thing? Yeah.
Well, the one big thing is we better all get out and campaign on climate change this year because it's a one chance in a lifetime.
Yeah. Great. Francis?
Well, clearly, the TUC's big campaign is for fair shares, fair growth. That's inclusive growth. That's what we want to see. But I think this issue about young people is absolutely critical. I emphasise this, paid internships. That means that people from any background can have a chance of experiencing work at the TUC. But I'm also going to be with the National Union of Students and bite the ballot tomorrow to encourage young people to vote.
It's National Voter Registration Day. Yeah. Mike?
I'd like to see a cross-party 20-year blueprint of what we're going to do for skills and education and stick to it.
Yeah. Brilliant.
I'd like Mike to get his wish. And I'd like, furthermore, for that to include a 3% of GDP, so 50 billion a year, 20-year commitment to spend on infrastructure, skills, and other productive investments, and control of that 50 billion a year to be handed outside of Parliament to a commission on infrastructure spending.
Yeah. Brilliant. Brilliant. And finally, Xavier.
I'll give you 2 for the price of 1.
Hey.
You're a good man.
Double teachers' salaries with the appropriate selection.
Are there any teachers here? You can vote for Xavier at the end.
He gets the lot.
And secondly, create a 5 million apprentice program over 10 years, not funded by government, because government doesn't really know fundamentally where the needs are. They may have an idea. And not focus on university education as much. Germany, only 20% of the population, the working population, goes to university, but they have a huge apprentice program trained by firms. You can be a very senior member of management with no university education, a successful apprentice program, and that creates a relationship, a bond effectively between the employees and the companies. So without an apprentice program, that participative sort of management style doesn't work. Those are the two things I would do.
Fantastic, thank you. Archbishop Justin, do you want to offer any final thoughts? And one question, I suppose, is a sort of genuine question from a politician, which is, when you have heard what you've heard tonight, and when you think about how this debate should and could unfold over the next 4 or 5 years, what would you like to see good people who care about this debate doing?
Final ideas, and then I try and answer that question. It seems to me that underlying what we were talking about was sustainability. That picked up the question in fact, in the General Synod debate I referred to, the word sustainability was aimed at issues of climate change. But I thought I was going to overrun my time anyway, so I cut a sentence. I think there's an awful lot in what people have been saying is essentially about the long term. And the challenge is how, in a 5-year electoral cycle with 5-minute reactions on Twitter and not much better in other forms of public discourse, how do we get a long-term view? And how do we actually say, because the doubling the 2.5%, that is a massive transfer. It has to be, it won't benefit this generation, it benefits the next one. And I have the benefit of not being elected, which is, I'll come back to in a minute. So I think that the big issue is around education skills, long-term, that's been underlying the things we've been saying, is looking at the long term, and that's where you touch on young people, because you're designing a good economy, a society, which will benefit them in the long term. And the challenge is, how do we do that? Is it a cross-party thing? Is it something that, like, for instance, certain values we have in society around the NHS is something that everyone accepts is a given and that nobody challenges because we all accept it's the right thing to do? That seems to me the big challenge and underlying issue. What was your question?
What do the good people do next to move this debate on? And I think engage, I mean, there's been a number of questions this evening about where's the practical steps, where's the action? What do good people do next to try and move the debate on, but actually begin grinding out some of the...
In practical action, it just reminds me of the aim we've got in my own, I don't call it an organisation, nobody who knows the Church of England will call it that, institution, is the employment of apprentices, is the development of apprenticeships. We have 9,000 listed buildings, which we spend huge 9-figure sums on in maintenance and development. Canterbury Cathedral alone has 350 full-time staff, of whom 5 are clergy. And they take on apprentices at a rate of knots. Let's widen that out. That's one thing we can do in the Church of England.
Yeah.
We can also do something, we can continue to reform and look afresh. And I saw Andrew Adonis come in earlier, and I've been hugely influenced by his book on education. We can look afresh at how we train and develop the almost 1 million young people who we educate in church schools. So there's some practical stuff for us.
And it feels like there are agenda items here where it should be possible to begin generating that long-term consensus now.
I think it's what good people do next. One is look for ways of, in their own areas, look for ways of taking on young people, of training and developing, and secondly, look for ways of developing this long-term consensus. That's what good people do. And there's a final step, which is obviously absolutely essential, is to ban all the old Etonians from senior positions.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this evening. I think it's been an extraordinary debate. And in sort of preparation for tonight, one of the things that I read was a remarkable essay written in 1935, and it was J.M. Keynes's Economic Prospects for Our Grandchildren. There's an extraordinary sentence in that essay, which is about the economic pessimism of the revolutionaries and the economic pessimism of the reactionaries. And what Keynes says is that the reactionaries will tell you that no change is possible and you might as well just give up hope. And the revolutionaries will tell you that the system is bankrupt and it just needs smashing to pieces. And when you look across the political world today, you don't have to look too far before you see new reactionaries and new revolutionaries. Happily, they're a lot tamer than the rise of the fascists and Oswald Mosley in the 1930s. And, you know, the Communist Party of Great Britain is not the force that it once was. But there is a real struggle, and I hope you've seen it tonight, amongst good people in the middle, between the reactionaries and the revolutionaries, to try and define this new social contract that Clive talked about. In the All Party Group, we hope to be one of the fora in which those practicalities get developed, where we find those points of consensus and deepen them, both in the short term and in the long term. And I hope you'll stay engaged in the debates that we try and have as we try and bring good people like the people on this panel together. Thanks very much indeed for joining us this evening, and please stay in touch.